Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank all my colleagues for their very gracious yielding to me, and thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. In beginning my remarks, I want to ask unanimous consent that my committee staff be granted floor privileges, the committee staff from the Veterans Affairs Committee, for the remainder of this week.
Without objection.
There's welcome news today, which is that the Senate has received from the House H.R. 6416, a bipartisan comprehensive measure that keeps faith with our veterans and makes sure that we continue our progress toward leaving no veteran behind. And I want to emphasize at the very start, this measure is a down payment. It is far from a final or even fully acceptable solution to many of the problems that it addresses. It has more than 70 provisions. It's broad and comprehensive in scope and scale. More veterans, many at risk of homelessness, will receive the care and benefits they need and deserve. VA hospitals will have better management and more mental health care givers and emergency room doctors. Families of veterans will be helped by extending critical education benefits to surviving members of those families. Work will finally begin to help descendants of veterans exposed to toxic substances. But again, on those issues and so many more, we are only taking another step in what must be a journey toward helping our veterans with the services that they need and they deserve and they have earned. One example, long awaited, a landmark move, will commence research on the descendants of veterans who have been exposed to toxic substances and address the painful residual wounds of war, an area that's all the more important today because we know that the modern field of combat is ridden with nerve gas and other toxics and poisonous substances that all too often may endanger not only the brave men and women engaged on the battlefield, but also their descendants. This measure expands the definition of homeless veterans to include individuals, perhaps women, fleeing domestic violence, and it broadens eligibility for critical homeless prevention programs. Many of those women who are fleeing brutality and violence deserve this kind of help. Under this legislation, the Veterans Health Administration will be given the flexibility it needs in scheduling physician workloads to bring them in line with the common practice that prevails in most medical centers. And it's past time that we adjust the 1950s schedules and practices and policies to work regulations within the VA hospital and the needs of today's veteran. One extraordinarily important provision here relates to mental health, long a priority for me. It would make it easier to hire mental health counselors and access mental health treatment, significantly overhauling VA construction practices, and authorize major medical construction projects in Reno, Nevada, and Long Beach, Florida. And on the issue of accountability, that is so critically important and needs so much work, a provision in this measure would limit the ability of the VA to place an employee who is under investigation for misconduct on paid administrative leave for more than 14 days. This limitation would end the current practice of placing problematic employees on long periods of administrative leave, paid administrative leave, and so the provision would force the VA leaders to address issues when they arise, to impose accountability. I want to thank my colleague, Senator Isaacson for his leadership, his dedication, his attention to detail, his flexibility in the best traditions of this body. He clearly has put veterans first by sharing their ideas, and they have come to us from many of the veteran service organizations, and I want to acknowledge all of them as well because they have been such a positive force. And I want to thank my staff on the Veterans Affairs Committee for their work on this bill and others that we passed, such as the Clay Hunt Veteran Suicide Prevention Bill, which I did in partnership with Senator McCain and Senator Isaacson. We need to do more to help veterans cope with opioid addiction, combat homelessness, protect veterans against identity theft, make sure that our healthcare system for veterans continues to improve. It is still clearly a work in progress and still fails to meet the demands of access for thousands, tens of thousands of our veterans, even as it provides quality health care to many, many others. Many of the current challenges faced by veterans are directly attributable to management failures, and that's why accountability needs to improve. I want to thank Senators Burr and Testa for their bipartisan agreement to move forward on these challenges, and hopefully we will continue their work in the next session. And likewise, I've worked with Senator Moran and Chairman Isaacson on numerous accountability reforms in the Veterans First Act that was before this chamber, again, providing goals and measures that we must achieve in the next Congress. Our bipartisan effort to pass, hopefully within the next few days, H.R. 6416 is a crucial test of whether there is necessary will and determination in this body to move ahead on the enormous challenges yet unmet and the enormous obligation that we have. Just as critical as the healthcare challenges, so too are the chronic problems in providing veterans the benefits they have earned, benefits that are denied them in decisions that they appeal. Today, over 450,000 veterans' appeals await a decision. That's why I introduced the Department of Veterans Appeals Modernization Act of 2016. The present appeals process is a travesty. It is a mockery of justice. It must be reformed. It must be given the resources to make it effective. And even when veterans earn benefits, there are too many examples of unequal application. I joined Senator Murray in her effort to ensure that all caregivers for severely wounded and disabled veterans, regardless of when the veteran served, have access to caregiver support services. These caregivers are moms and dads, spouses, children who provide care day after day after day at great expense and burden to them with very little support from a nation that should be grateful to them as it is to the veterans themselves. Simply put, veterans deserve better and they deserve more. Even when they have grievances, often they are denied a day in court, forced into arbitration agreements concerning their reemployment rights and workplace protections. That is why I introduced the Justice for Service Members Act in June to clarify that service members cannot be denied access to the courthouse and forced into arbitration, and that service members cannot be forced to sacrifice those rights as a condition of future or continued employment. It's about basic American justice. Who deserves it more, that justice, than our veterans who fight for it, die for it, and should be never denied it. I want to thank, again, all of my colleagues who've worked with me over these past 2 years. We owe every veteran, regardless of the war or the conflict, regardless of the era, the basic guarantee that they will never be left behind, that this nation will keep faith with them, and this body owes them the obligation to summon the political will to cross partisan lines to make sure that we keep faith with them. And as I yield the floor today, I want to express my gratitude again to Chairman Isaacson and say, I yield the floor today, but none of us should ever yield in the fight to help our veterans. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I thank the senator from Connecticut for his recognition, but I want to take this moment on the floor to praise him for the contribution he's made to the committee over the last 2 years. I want to tell you a story. Richard became ranking member the same year and the same time I became chairman. We made a commitment to one another. We were going to move forward on a united Veterans Committee, address the problems of our veterans, and do it in a bipartisan fashion. To set the tone for that, we introduced the Clay Hunt Suicide Prevention Act, which Richard Blumenthal introduced, and passed unanimously in the committee and 99-0 on the floor of the Senate in the first weeks of this Congress. We did so to set the table that whatever the problem is, the problems are not, we should never let our pettiness and our politics and our partisanship stop us from helping a veteran. And because of Richard Blumenthal and his effort on suicide prevention and our commitment to make it bipartisan, we passed that unanimously early on in the session, and since that time have addressed other issues that well. In fact, the bill that we discussed today, which is named in part for Richard Blumenthal, is, as he said a minute ago, a down payment on the continuing debt we owe to our veterans who have served us well. I said that first day in the committee when I took over as chairman, you know, there are no Republican veterans and no Democratic veterans. There are only American veterans. There are the Americans that fought for our flag, fought for our Constitution, fought for our liberty, and fought for each of us. And I'm proud to have fought with Richard in the foxhole of the United States Senate for our veterans. There is much left to be done. But with the passage of this act today, which is named after Senator Blumenthal and Congressman Jeff Miller, who's retiring in the House, we're making another down payment on what we owe our veterans.